So yesterday we had the Diablo 4 development stream going over a lot of the changes coming with Season 4, things like the Itemization Overhaul, a ton of new systems coming to Itemization and coming to crafting, some of the new endgame changes and new endgame systems, and a ton of other massive information. I think this was easily the biggest developer live stream we've gotten for Diablo 4. I think this is going to be the biggest update that Diablo 4 has ever gotten, and we didn't even get any information on the actual Season 4 theme and new mechanics. All of the information in yesterday's developer live stream was stuff coming permanently to the game that is not directly tied to Season 4. So everything we're going over is going to be on the Eternal Realms, the Seasonal Realms, and is all going to be permanent additions or changes to the entirety of Diablo 4. Now, a big piece of information to start off with is Season 4 has been delayed. Season 3 will now go until May 14th, which is when Season 4 will start. So this means Season 3 has been extended, Season 4 start date has been pushed back, and the PTR for Season 4 will be on April 2nd until April 9th. So it'll be 1 week of PTR where we can test all of these changes. Now this video is going to be an overview of a lot of the new additions and changes coming with Season 4. I'm going to be doing more videos going more in depth with every single one of these new system changes or new systems being added in, because there's actually a ridiculous amount of content. There's way too much to go into the specifics of all of this in one video. Now, as we've known for a long time, the big itemization overhaul was coming with this patch, and this is split into a ton of different categories, but a really important part of this is the developers' guiding principles when making this overhaul. The first principle being quality over quantity, so you're gonna be getting less drops in total, but these drops are gonna be much more valuable, they're gonna be much easier to sift through, and there's gonna be a lot more really cool, exciting moments because of a lot of the other changes. The second being that the best items you come across are gonna have a journey to become the best items in the game. So you're going to get an item drop, then you're going to take it to all of these new customization and crafting systems, and that's going to make a best item in the game. There's going to be a lot more of the game's power and customization in these new crafting systems than in just picking up an item off the ground, and that's basically what you get. And the third being surprise and delight. There's a lot of changes in this where you're going to get an item drop, and it's going to be more exciting than getting almost any item drop previous to these big changes, and a bunch of different elements are going to play into this surprise and delight element of things just being much more exciting when you get loot. And one of the starting elements being a lot of base item updates. For instance, only sacred items are going to drop in World Tier 3 now, only ancestral items are going to drop in World Tier 4. So once you start climbing world tiers, you're not going to have to worry about finding lower tier items that are completely useless anymore. This change and getting a lot less item drops in general is going to be a massive help in not having to sift through so many items. And then the amount of affixes on items are also going to change. So legendary items will now be getting only 3 affixes, and rare items are now going to only have 2. And this is also going to be in conjunction with an update where affix values are going to be a lot stronger. So previous to these changes, a lot of singular affixes weren't super strong. Like, you wouldn't really notice if you got an upgrade on one item and you got some higher affixes. You really wouldn't notice because they weren't super strong. But now, with you only having 3 affixes on a legendary item, affixes are going to be much stronger. They gave some examples and the increases are absolutely massive. So instead of, say, I have a weapon with like 50 intelligence on it, now you could have like 100 intelligence. Now, I don't think it's going to be exactly 50% increases, but they're going to be pretty massive. And within these base item upgrades, they're also going to be removing tons of different affixes. They're going to be adding in some new ones, which we'll go over later. And this includes a lot or a majority of the conditional affixes being removed. So a lot of the affixes you're going to find are going to be much stronger, much more relevant to your build. You're going to feel them a lot more when you equip new items with these much stronger affixes. And a lot of the affixes are just going to be much more interesting. And there's also a handful of smaller changes that are also going to help specifically with sifting through items, because for instance, right now you could find an item with like multiple affixes that give you plus ranks to different skills or skill categories. After this change, you'll only be able to have one affix on an item that increases their ranks to a skill. So no longer are you going to be able to find gloves with quite literally 4+ ranks to different skills on them, which is just completely useless. And you're also only going to be finding your main stat on items now. So if you say get a weapon right now, that weapon could be good rolls for you, but then it would have a stat that's not your main class stat. So maybe if you're on a druid, you would get dexterity on your weapon. Now that main stat will always be your class's main stat, but you'll still also be able to get all stats rolls. So this is a pretty impactful change, but it's also basically just a change in how loot is being targeted for you. And also, along with all of these changes, you're now able to trade all items but Uber uniques. So you can now freely trade legendary and unique items to players as well as all of the other item rarities. Now you won't be able to trade items that you've already crafted onto other players, but if you just get a unique drop or a legendary drop, you can trade that to somebody. And then we have some additional miscellaneous changes. These are all still pretty impactful, but they're just kind of general changes that don't fit into other categories. For instance, once you start facing level 95 and up enemies, legendary drops will always be 925 item level. And this is really important because once you're facing level 95 enemies and above, you're pretty far into the end game. And one of the big overarching values of these changes is to make sifting items much easier and to make items you're actually picking up and getting as drops have a higher quality than they used to. So now once you get that far into the end game, you just have to worry about the stat rolls on these legendary items you're getting. You don't have to worry about getting really good affix rolls and then having it be like 825 item level. And likewise, when talking about unique drops, there's also going to be some pretty heavy changes in how you can go about obtaining uniques. So first off, uniques will start to drop much earlier. So in World Tier 1 and World Tier 2, you can start getting uniques. You were only able to get uniques in World Tier 3 before, and now all unique items can drop in World Tier 3. Previously, a bunch of uniques could only drop in World Tier 4. Uber uniques can start dropping from any enemies level 55 and up. They'll still be 925 and there'll still be max rolled affixes. And I think this is a pretty cool update, even though Uber uniques are still going to be absurdly rare from level 55 enemies. At one point throughout the history of Diablo 4, you'll be in a season and you'll be facing a level 60 enemy and they'll drop your perfect Uber unique, and you'll remember that moment. You'll remember that moment. You'll remember that season where you basically got your best in slot Uber unique item at like level 60, which will be absurd. It'll be a really cool moment, even though it'll be absurdly rare. And then some quick fire changes. Gems are going to have their stats change up. They're going to be simpler and they're going to have a longer crafting tail. All the salvaging costs, crafting costs, and rewards from different objectives and resources are all going to be retuned because there's going to be a lot less drops to get those resources. So you're just going to be getting more of them in different areas instead of all of them coming from salvaging items. The Affix rerolling system, which is going to continue to be in the game where you use gold to reroll an affix, that's now going to have its gold cost capped. So usually every time you reroll, the gold increases and it infinitely increases. Now it's going to be capped. It still can get pretty expensive, but it's going to be capped. So once you get to a point, you could still continue to reroll that item to try to get a best roll that you possibly can. They're also going to be removing a ton of materials in the game. So there's going to be less types of herbs and less types of ore. So they're going to consolidate a lot of those to make it much more simple, because in the game right now, you have tons of different herbs, tons of different ores, and to craft like a potion or something, it still takes like 6 different herbs anyway. So consolidating them all into a few instead of a ton isn't going to necessarily make it easier to craft more, but it's going to make it much less convoluted. And then you're going to be able to get Forgotten Souls from a lot more elements throughout the game. You're going to be able to get them from Whispers, you're going to be able to get them from Treasure Goblins, and you're going to be able to randomly get them from Elites. This is also a much bigger changes to Elites, because now Elites are going to have a chance to just explode into piles of loot with basically any different resource in the game you can imagine. So rarely when you kill an Elite, they'll explode into a bunch of Forgotten Souls, or a bunch of herbs, or a bunch of metals, or even a bunch of boss items. So all the boss items you need to go face the endgame bosses, rarely Elites will explode in a bunch of those items as well. And again, this is following one of their big overarching sentiments of this is surprise and delight. Rarely you'll kill an Elite and it'll just explode with a ton of really valuable loot. And then we have a pretty massive change that I think is one of the biggest quality of life changes we've gotten in the game so far, and that is the overhaul to the Codex of Power. So currently the Codex of Power, you just have some dungeons you can go do and you'll get the lowest rolled version of an aspect that you can infinitely put on items. But besides that, all the other aspects you have to save as literal items in your stash, in your inventory. You have to save a ton of different ones because you only have one use of those and they have random rolls. Now all of this is going to be combined into the Codex of Power. There are now no legendary aspect items. Your stash is going to be filled with them. Your inventories are going to be filled with them. All of them are going to be in the Codex of Power. And now every legendary aspect in the game is going to be in the Codex, and you're going to be upgrading the Codex for each one of these powers. So let's say you get an item with a legendary aspect you want, and let's say its roll goes up to 100%. Let's say you get a 75% roll. You go extract that into the Codex of Power. Now in your Codex of Power, that legendary aspect has that roll. It's 75% out of 100. You can infinitely take that aspect out of the Codex of Power and put it on as many items as you want. It's never going to run out. It's always going to say 75%. But then let's say you get a 100% roll. You go put that in the Codex of Power. Now it's a 100% roll in the Codex of Power. You now permanently have infinite uses of the max rolled version of that legendary aspect. There's some changes to how you get legendary aspects because depending on what world tier you're in, you can't get the best roll legendary aspect. So if you're in like World Tier 1, World Tier 2, or World Tier 3, you can't get the best roll legendary aspects. And it seems like they're going to have increasing rolls to what you can get as you go up the world tiers. But once you get in World Tier 4, you can now start to get the max rolls of legendary aspects. But also because of how the Codex is working now, aspects are actually going to be buffed. Because if you go into this new version of the Codex and you have an aspect you haven't upgraded at all, it'll say like, let's say 1 out of 16. That's how many different ranks of this aspect there could be. If you get a max roll item, it will then be 16 out of 16. So this means a bunch of aspects have been buffed, but the best rolled versions of aspects, you're going to have to be in World Tier 4. They're generally going to be a bit harder to get. One of the best quality of life changes in the game, you're going to have so much more stash space. You're not going to have to worry as much about finding a bunch of different rolls of these aspects. If you get a new item, now you have to go find another best roll legendary aspect. Now you just get one and you have it in your Codex for the entirety of the season. But that brings us to one of the new crafting additions called tempering. And this is going to play into items having less affix rolls overall. So as we went over, legendary items are now going to come with 3 affix instead of 4. Rare items are going to come with 2 affixes instead of 4. But the tempering system is going to allow you to add up to 2 new affixes at the high end. And these new affixes from this new crafting system are not just going to be a bunch of affixes you can normally get. There's also going to be a ton of new affixes that you can only get from this tempering system. Things like more projectiles or larger projectiles or larger skills. So if you throw out like 1 bone spear, instead it could throw out 2 bone spears. Or if you throw out a big AoE effect, instead that AoE effect would be much bigger. There's going to be a ton of new and very interesting affixes from the tempering system. So to start off, there's going to be a new resource that's tied into the tempering system called temper manuals. Now, temper manuals are going to have 4 different affixes on every single one of them. And what you would then do in the tempering system is you would add your item into this new crafter. You would choose one of these manuals with these 4 random affixes, and then you would randomly roll one of these affixes from this temper manual onto your item. And for ancestral items, you'll be able to add 2 affixes from this system. So if you go get an ancestral legendary item, it'll come with 3 affixes. Then you can roll 2 more of these tempered affixes onto that item. And again, these tempered affixes could be things you can't normally get on items. And there's going to be a bunch of different categories with these temper manuals and what you can put on items. So first off, there's going to be 6 different categories. There's going to be weapons, offensive, defensive, utility, mobility, and resource. So all items, you're not going to be able to use all tempering manuals on them. For instance, an amulet, you can use all of these different categories except the weapon category. So you would put in your item, you would choose one of these categories, then you would have a list of different manuals that you choose to put one of the affixes on this item. And again, it's going to be random from the 4 affixes on that manual. There's also going to be general manuals and class specific manuals. And they did show off some examples. For instance, some stuff for a necromancer. One of the affix rolls was changed for bone spear projectiles to be cast twice. And then there was things like your bone spirit's explosion size was also increased. They also kind of of went over, the cooldown is going to be very strong and valuable affixes you can now get a lot more of. So you could get cooldown reduction on specific abilities and get really high cooldown on specific abilities. So that's also going to be a pretty big difference with these changes. So you put in your item to the Tempering Crafter, you choose a category, you choose a manual between generic or class specific. It's going to give you one of those 4 affixes, and those affixes are still going to have role differences. So say one would be like 10 to 15%. It's going to give you one of those random rolls, and then you're going to have that affix now placed on your item. And like mentioned, Ancestral can have 2 total tempering affixes on them, but it's random between those 4 affixes and they have rolls. Let's say you don't like the roll, you want to re-roll. Items are going to have a tempering durability, which is probably going to be renamed to tempering rolls. And let's say your Ancestral legendary item has 5 total rolls. So you have 5 different opportunities to get the different stats you want on this item. If you run out of durability or tempering rolls, that item doesn't get any more. You have basically bricked your item if you didn't get anything good. So this is a system that you'll kind of be able to brick items, because you may just get some rolls that don't even work for your build. That item's kind of junk now, but this does add so much more variation into the system, and a lot of these new affixes seem pretty cool. Even just having what's basically multicast or additional projectiles is going to be so fun for so many builds. But this is just one of the new crafting systems, because next up we have Masterworking. Now this is going to take place of the current upgrade system we have in Diablo 4. So currently you can go upgrade, say, high level items 5 different times. That's just going to upgrade all of the affixes and all the stats on that item. Very simple, and there's not much different variations you can get. But Masterworking is going to be much more substantial. Masterworking is going to be an upgrade system. There's going to be 12 total ranks you can upgrade on every item. Now when you go and upgrade an item, all the affixes on it, including the tempered aspects, are going to increase. Something like a 5% increase to all affixes. But then 3 different times while upgrading up to the 12 times. So at rank 4, at rank 8, and at rank 12, only one affix is going to get a much more substantial increase. So something closer to a 25% increase. So you upgraded your item 3 times, all of your stats got increased every upgrade. You upgrade it the 4th time, one stat gets a much bigger upgrade. And it's going to be random what stat is upgraded on the 4th, 8th, and 12th upgrade. But you could land all 3 of the big upgrades on one affix. Let's say you have a weapon with 100 intelligence. You get to the first big roll, it hits on intelligence. Intelligence gets a massive buff. You upgrade a bunch more, you get to the 8th upgrade, it hits on intelligence. Then you upgrade more times, you get to the 12th upgrade, it hits on intelligence. Now you would have some absurd amount of intelligence on this one item. But likewise, these upgrades could just hit 3 different affixes, and either one of these potential could be good for your build. And also, these upgrades can hit your tempered affixes. So like mentioned, let's say you have one of these rolls that has a chance to throw out more projectiles. You could potentially get the 3 big upgrades on that tempered affix. So you could get one of these crazy tempered affixes and get an absurd amount of power added into that affix from Masterworking. But let's say you go through the Masterworking system and you don't like where the upgrades ended up. You can reset items through the Masterworking system. It would go back down to 0 upgrades. All of the stats that got upgraded will lose their upgrades, but the item will not be changed in any other way. Now, you're not going to get back all the resources you used originally upgrading it, but this allows you, if you have like a perfect rolled item, to just keep going through the Masterworking system and resetting it using more resources until you get the upgrades you actually want. And also, the Masterworking system is going to work on uniques and uber uniques. And a really big thing to note is a lot of these uniques have stats you can't get on other items, or at least other items in that category. So there are some specific stats to uniques. You could get all 3 of the big Masterworking upgrades on this super unique affix that could just be crazy in your build. So this system is going to take a lot of resources. It's going to give you a lot of power. It's going to give a lot of variation, but it's also going to give you a lot of control. Because you can fully reset it, you can just farm up as much resources as you want and try to get all 3 of these big upgrades on one affix, and that item could be absolutely crazy. And then we have another new system that's not a new crafting system, but it plays into it pretty heavily, called greater affixes. Now, greater affixes are just going to be upgrades of normal affixes that can randomly be on items when they drop. This is not a crafting system, this is a new addition to random drops. And the beam on that dropped item will be a little bit different, and it'll have some type of indicator by its name telling you that it has a greater affix. Now, greater affixes are going to be 1.5 times the best roll that affix could be. And it's always going to be a top roll. So let's say there's a pair of gloves and you can get intelligence on them. And let's say they could get up to 100 intelligence as a max roll normally. But let's say that intelligence roll becomes a greater affix. It'll now be 150, and it'll always roll 150 if you get a greater affix. And multiple of the affixes can be greater affixes. They specifically showed items with 2 greater affixes, but it does seem like all 3 of the rolls on, let's say, a legendary item can be greater affixes on a drop. Greater affixes can only be rolled on legendary or unique items. That one's very important because, as we mentioned, there are specific affixes on unique items, so you can only get on those. So you could get a unique item with that crazy good roll as a greater affix. So now it's 1.5 times what it normally would be. Then you could still go masterwork that item, and you could potentially get all 3 of the big upgrades of master rolling on that already upgraded greater affix. So there are some high roll possibilities to just get some astronomically high stats of certain affix rolls. Now, there was a handful of class changes shown off in this update, but there's going to be an absurd amount of class changes overall, and this isn't just stat changes, they're actually changing the design and how a lot of these class elements actually work. So for instance, for necromancers and druid companions, they will now gain 100% of your player stats. So just like the seneschal of season 3, how it gains 100% of your stats, that's why a lot of its attacks can be crazy strong. That's going to now fold over to necromancer minions and druid companions. So these pets are going to be much stronger than before, and that's a big change. You're going to have things like the ultimate ability lacerate for druids. Now both of its upgrades that you have right now are going to be put into a single upgrade, and it's going to get a new upgrade. You have things like sorcerer's frozen orb. Now there's a change in how you actually use it. So where your cursor is pointed, that's where the frozen orb explodes. You have a change to inner sight for the rogue, which is one of their unique class mechanics. A lot of the necromancer's book of the dead elements were either upgraded or completely changed, and there's a lot more class changes that they didn't show us. They only showed us examples. And then something that's pretty important is with season 4, we will be getting double the unique items we normally get. So normally there's 1 new unique item for each class and then usually a generic unique item, but with season 4 we're getting 1 new uber unique item, which is called Tyrael's Might, which does seem pretty interesting. But we're also going to be getting 2 new uniques for every single class. So double the uniques for season 4. And then, as mentioned, there's just going to be an absurd amount of changes for every class. Some of the big concepts being they want a lot of the more interesting elements to be stronger, such as Dust Devils for Barbarian. They're changing a lot of the uniques with that, and they're making a lot of the base damage rolls of, say, legendary aspects or in your talent tree. They're making a lot of those much stronger as well, and they're making those scale with your weapon damage as well. But that brings us to some new endgame changes and new content additions. Now, starting off, the world tier multiplier for experience gains is going up. They want us to get to endgame quicker now, and presumably that's because there's more endgame content, there's a lot more systems and much more interesting gearing in the endgame, so they just want us to get there quicker. But that brings us to massive Helltide changes. Helltide's getting basically overhauled, and they're actually going to be adding in a lot of the elements from the season 2 blood harvest system into Helltides. So first off, higher density, that's something that's been needed. There's just going to be a lot more enemies to kill. You're going to have a threat meter kind of like you had in Blood Harvest, but the threat meter in Helltide is going to be a little bit different. There's going to be a little symbol at the top of your screen, and there's going to be a bar. This bar is going to be split into different sections, and once you fill up that bar, it basically starts an event on you where you have to kill a bunch of waves that's going to spawn these big waves of enemies, tons of elites. Once you kill all of those waves, a new Hellborn boss is going to spawn. Now, Hellborn are basically the equivalent of the blood class enemies from season 2, where a vampire infused version of any of the playable classes spawn and attack you. That's going to be what the Hellborn is. It's just going to be a hell infused version of a player class. It's going to be a boss, going to be very strong, and it's going to drop a ton of loot after you kill it. So you're basically getting a threat level, you're basically getting GTA stars while running through the Helltide killing things. There's going to be a lot more of ambushes and dynamic events and new monster spawns while you're going through the Helltide. That was pretty good in Blood Harvest. You would randomly get like point, tons of enemies just spawn or drop out of the sky on top of you. You're going to be getting a lot more of those. There's going to be a lot more mini events all throughout the zone. And they actually showed one of these when they were walking past something. A big hell worm popped out of the ground and just spewed out tons of elites and tons of enemies. So that's just going to be a lot more dynamic and spawning tons of enemies and giving you new mini events to go do. You're going to be able to go on Helltides in lower world tiers, so that'll be good for leveling. Like mentioned, that Hellborn you kill will drop a bunch of resources. It'll also drop Lord Zir summoning mats, so that'll also be pretty nice in the Helltide. And there's also going to be a new summoning material that you get from the Hellborn, and I think from other elements in Helltides. And this new material is actually going to be used to summon a new boss in Helltides called the Blood Maiden. So kind of like how in Blood Harvest, you or other people would put in resources into the 3 podiums, and then you would start that event where it spawns tons of enemies, and then 3 bosses would spawn in the middle. That event was very well liked. There's basically going to be that for Helltides, and it's going to spawn this massive Blood Maiden boss that's obviously going to give you a ton of loot. And while mentioning that the Hellborn can drop Lord Seer summoning materials, they also mentioned that a ton of other elements in the game can now summon the boss materials that you need to summon the endgame bosses. Treasure goblins can drop summoning mats, whispers can drop summoning mats, open world events, so this would also be events in Helltides, can drop boss summoning mats. And elites, as we went over, also have that rare chance to explode into materials, which can be boss summoning mats. But that brings us to some pretty big changes for the endgame boss ladder. Now, the endgame boss ladder is all those bosses that you need summoning materials to go fight. They have dedicated loot tables, and Duriel is the main way you get uber uniques. And the first big change is going to be a new boss, which is Andariel. And she was one of the bosses from the main campaign, but her boss fight is going to be changed up in this version. She's going to have new abilities. She's going to be in a new boss room. And to summon her, you need to get materials from the Beast of Ice and Lord Zir, and presumably all of these other elements that can now drop boss mats will also be able to give you Andariel boss mats. And again, she's going to be same as Duriel. She's going to share the same loot table as Duriel, so she's going to be another way to farm uber uniques. So there's just more opportunities to get uber uniques and another new endgame boss. But there's actually going to be a new element tied to all of these endgame bosses, because all of these endgame bosses are now going to have a new uber version of themselves that are going to be level 200. These level 200 versions are going to have a much higher chance for uber uniques. They're going to give you a lot more loot, and the first time you defeat every level 200 uber version of these bosses, you're going to get one of the materials that allows you to craft uber uniques. And if you don't know what that is, in season 3 they added a new system where you could break down uber uniques to get what's called a resplendent spark, and then you could use a certain amount of those sparks to craft an uber unique you wanted. So now if you get into the end game and you get these new resources you need to summon these uber bosses, you can start getting resplendent sparks without ever getting an uber unique. And because there's so many of these bosses, you could craft at least one uber unique just from defeating these uber level 200 bosses. To summon these new uber bosses, you need to do the new content system coming with season 4, which is called the Artificer's Pit. Now this is a new endgame system, which is basically greater rifts from Diablo 3. This new system is going to start at level 100 enemies. There's going to be 100 floors of this system. So every new tier you complete, you unlock a new tier, makes enemies harder, but it will give you more rewards. And you're doing the same thing as in greater rifts. You're killing enemies on what's basically a timer. If you die, you just lose 30 seconds on that timer. Once you kill enough enemies, a portal spawns, you go into a boss room, you face a boss. But these are actually going to be a little bit more interesting, specifically these boss rooms, because in these boss rooms, you're going to be facing what seems to be like the dungeon bosses we usually face. There's going to be shades of other bosses in these fights. And these shades aren't going to be things you attack, but they just randomly show up and do boss attacks from other boss fights. So randomly, a shade of Lilith will spawn in and do her dread waves. Maybe Duriel will spawn in and try to slam you into the wall. So as you're fighting this normal dungeon boss, you're going to be having to dodge and deal with mechanics from any of the other bosses in the game. And as you go higher and higher tiers in this new system, those attacks become more frequent. So I think this is actually a really cool way to make all of these boss fights much more dynamic and more interesting, even though you're facing kind of the same dungeon boss. And if you go through one of these runs, you defeat the boss at the end, you're going to get a bunch of loot from the boss. boss, and you're also going to get one of these new Stygian stones. Now, Stygian stones are the way you summon the uber bosses. So that's going to be the main way you face these super hard new endgame bosses. You're also going to be getting a chest at the end if you go through and defeat the boss. And this chest is going to be giving you the resources for the Masterworking system. Or this is going to be the main way you get these resources. You'll still have some other elements of the game that can give some, but this new pit is the way you mainly get Masterworking resources. So this is going to play very heavily into the Masterworking system. This is going to play very heavily into the new Uber boss system, and it's going to be greater rifts, which a lot of people have wanted. And as you get to higher and higher floors in this system, you're going to be getting more drops. You're not going to be getting better drops, just more. So getting super high pit runs, you're going to be getting a lot of legendary items. But that's an overview of the information we got that's coming with these massive Season 4 changes. And like mentioned, this is already going to be a long video, and that's not all the information we got. I'm going to be doing other videos going into specifics of all these different systems because there's just so much information and there's still so much more we haven't seen. In fact, next week, we're getting the full patch notes, and they asked for a week because the patch note list is gonna be so long that they needed that amount of time to actually make an accurate patch note list. So it's going to be pretty absurd, but make sure to subscribe if you want to have more in-depth looks at all these systems. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.